The original Ghost in the Shell was released before the turn of the millennium, at a time when society seemed on the brink of a technological revolution. The 20th century had given rise to destruction and power on an industrial scale never seen before, and this trend looked only to continue as people asked themselves, where would technology lead us next? Nothing demonstrates this fear of the unknown as well as the Y2K conspiracy.
A single faulty unit could corrupt every other computer in the world.
That can't be true, honey. If it were, I'd be terrified.
2 hours later.
With computers becoming exponentially more powerful and artificial intelligence seeming right around the corner, this film asks deep questions about the uncertain future of humanity and challenges us to define humanity itself. It sent ripples through science fiction and was a massive inspiration for films like The Matrix, but whilst The Matrix is at heart an action movie with some higher concepts sprinkled in, Ghost in the Shell is a much more cerebral and introspective film. The ghost in the title refers to a person's consciousness or soul, whilst the shell is the body they inhabit. The distinction between consciousness and body has been grappled with by philosophers for hundreds of years, and we are not much closer to defining consciousness as a concept itself. The idea that body and mind are separate is called dualism, and is largely the product of the French philosopher René Descartes. Descartes asserted that the mind is a non-physical entity, and the body is a physical entity, and one is not dependent on the other. However, this argument gives rise to the famous problem of mind-body causal interaction. That is to say, if the mind is non-physical, how can it interact with the physical body? When I raise my hand, how does my mind communicate with my hand if it occupies a different plane of reality? Or how is it that the mind is affected by changes to my body? Descartes' argument seems to be at odds with medical science. To quote the neurologist Sam Harris, when you damage areas of the brain, faculties are lost. It's not that everyone with brain damage has their soul perfectly intact and they just can't get the words out. Everything about your mind can be damaged by damaging the brain. The centerpiece of the film is the conflict between the cyborg Major, who has an artificial body but a living brain, and the puppet master, who is, by some potentially redundant semantics, more than or at least distinct from an artificial intelligence. Ghost in the Shell is too quick to assert that one cannot define consciousness, and then gives full credit to the puppet master's claim that he is a thinking entity. The intelligence displayed in this film, as well as films like Ex Machina, is particularly narcissistic and solipsistic. This is less "I think therefore I am" and more "I think therefore I'm the only one that matters." The Major is a government assassin who kills remorselessly, and the puppet master uses his first declaration of agency to claim rights under political asylum. Both of these courses of action betray a lack of appreciation for the moral landscape, one being murder and the other being seeking refuge under bureaucracy. There is no demonstration of or appeal to empathy or altruism. Human beings are social creatures, and much of our progress and development springs from dialogue and moral teachings. Feelings of oneness and nirvana are central to many world religions. People are universally connected by this feeling, but a desire for this unity and moral progress is never sought after by either the Major or the puppet master. They do of course join minds by the end of the film, but this is done for different reasons. The puppet master highlights a sort of legacy and fortification argument. By allowing for variation, their existence is protected from destruction by a single source like a virus. This is Darwinian progress, but not moral progress, and stands to separate the trajectory of the AI's intelligence from humanity's course. Human brains contain mirror neurons, which allow us to empathize both emotionally and physically. We can see our parents tie a shoelace, for example, and from that tie our own shoelaces. In the same way, we can see someone experience tragedy or jubilation, and we can share in that emotion. If we grant that consciousness is a product of our brains, and our brains contain mirror neurons that enable us to empathize, then we must also grant that empathy is a part of our consciousness. If the puppet master fails to empathise and take note of the moral landscape, can we call him conscious? And if that is in question, what about psychopaths that walk among us today who are themselves completely devoid of empathy? The way the film presents our ability to communicate with an AI is also a little strange. Neil deGrasse Tyson made a good point about our expectation of being able to communicate with aliens to be ridiculous. We share DNA with a banana and monkeys, but we have no expectation of having any real communication with them. But we assume a species which has mastered intergalactic travel and has no common DNA or culture is going to be able to communicate with us just fine. I can't have a conversation with the word processor I'm using to write this, but I can have some fraction more of a conversation with something like Siri. But in the future, there will be some artificial intelligence advanced to the point that they will pass the Turing test and be indistinguishable from the 7+ billion voices echoing around the planet. I just don't buy that, given the immense computing power that exists and the potential for exponential development and the potential to proliferate through the internet, that they would ever be constrained or even need to interact with humans.
All our work is gone. Ultron cleared out, used the internet as an escape hatch.
He's in your files, he's in the internet. What if he decides to access
Nuclear codes.
nuclear codes?
Not to discredit AI films entirely, but I feel AI is represented better as a vague, ever-spreading entity in films like Her and even as Skynet in the Terminator series. And sometimes AI is represented very badly. The live-action remake of this film goes in a very different direction to the original. Some scenes are rearranged, and whilst there is a Puppet Master style antagonist, the film is not focused around any clear single conflict, and instead gets bogged down in espionage, betrayal, and a swamp of cliches. Whether it's the overreaching and ostensibly American military contractor who wants to weaponize everything, or the half-assed amnesia plotline, we have seen these ideas explored with more depth and clarity in other films. Narratively, the remake is unfocused. The first half is good, the opening action scene is creative and entertaining, and the later scene in the nightclub is also competent, if a little meandering. One thing the remake absolutely nails is the aesthetic, and this makes up for its shortcomings in spades. The world of Ghost in the Shell 2017 is dirty and bleak, in contrast to its perpetually neon-lit skyline. The characters all look excellent, and they were very reminiscent of the newer Deus Ex games, with crude metal augmentations and enhanced limbs jutting out of people's flesh and faces and stuff. Certain scenes in the film, such as the opening sequence with the robotic geisha girls, looks like something out of a Nicholas Winding Refn film, and if you are prepared to ignore the film's plot, you can at least appreciate that it looks cool. The aesthetic of the original is very different, but the detail to the animation is mind-blowingly impressive. There's a 3-minute sequence in the original film of just music and haunting visuals of this dystopian future. No single scene in the remake is as memorable as this, but there are some very interesting moments. The representation of hacking and the Major's deep dive really stuck with me as one example. The story of the remake seems much more like RoboCop than the original, a main plot point being the suppression of the Major's identity and memory as she's manipulated by government factions. And occasionally there were some flashes, particularly in the ending, of the film Wanted, which does not work to the film's strength at all. The remake is trying to capture the significantly more interesting moment in the original film when the Major cross Puppet Master hybrid steps out into the world with a sense of discovery to carve out a new cause and purpose in its existence. By the end of the remake, however, Scarlett Johansson is triumphantly monologuing into the sunset, having just shown that she will not be manipulated by some foreign shady government entity, but will continue to be part of some homegrown shady government hit squad that has the rubber stamp approval of the Japanese Prime Minister. Because nationalism, I guess? As the film ended, all I could think about was this awkward mess.
This is me taking control. This is me taking back control of my life.
you done lately?
The elephant in the room is that Scarlett Johansson is white and playing an Asian character, but the source material is primarily concerned with how there are no well-defined boundaries for humanity, particularly as technology becomes more and more integrated into our lives, and higher in philosophical concepts of consciousness and agency. Colonialism and culture are important things to discuss, but the race of the Major is so far removed from the point that the original film was making as to be completely irrelevant. Whilst I was watching the new Ghost in the Shell, I was so taken in by the aesthetic of the film that I just became frustrated that this was the result. I want to see more of this world and these characters that are so beautifully realised, but with a narrative that actually makes sense and doesn't feel like the highlight reel of a TV show. But that's unlikely to happen now because the film has bombed epically.